When you walk past the glittering glass towers of the IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C., it feels like the financial order of the world is set in stone. But thousands of miles away in Accra, Ghana, and in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, another sound is rising. Not the language of spreadsheets or interest rates, but the pounding of drums, the chants of citizens, and the bold voices of presidents who are saying enough. For decades, the IMF has held Africa in its grip. Loan after loan, condition after condition, entire nations found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of debt, forced to cut schools, hospitals, and food subsidies just to meet structural adjustments. To many, it seemed unshakable. But today, something remarkable is unfolding. Ghana, once called the star pupil of IMF reforms, is openly challenging the very institution that has shaped its economy for years. And right beside it, Burkina Faso, under the young and fiery leadership of President Ibrahim Traoré, is refusing to even enter the IMF's classroom of debt. This is not just about two countries. It is about the possibility of an African rebellion against a financial empire that has lasted for generations. If the cracks in the IMF are beginning to show, could it be that its collapse has already begun from the very place the world least expected? So, I ask you, are we witnessing the birth of Africa's financial freedom, or simply another passing storm in history? And more importantly, do you believe leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré can truly build a future without the IMF? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. At the heart of this unfolding drama is Ghana, a nation long considered one of the IMF's most reliable partners in West Africa. For decades, Ghana had been hailed as the model student of IMF reforms. Washington economists and European think tanks frequently pointed to Accra as proof that structural adjustment programs could work even if they came at painful costs. But in 2025, that image cracked wide open. Inside Ghana's parliament, fiery debates erupted over a new IMF loan package. Citizens filled the galleries, their voices echoing across the chamber. No more debt. The government, already under immense pressure from rising living costs, was being told once again to slash subsidies for fuel and food. Yet the people had reached a breaking point. Teachers complained that their schools were falling apart while millions of dollars were being siphoned away to service foreign debt. Farmers argued they could not afford imported fertilizer because the cedi had been weakened by IMF-mandated currency adjustments. Even nurses who once remained quiet joined protests demanding an end to cuts in healthcare budgets. What made this moment historic was not simply the anger in the streets. It was the decision of Ghana's leadership to stand up in defiance. For the first time, Accra openly rejected IMF's conditionalities, labeling them a stranglehold on national sovereignty. The government declared it would explore alternative financing options through partnerships with regional banks, gold-backed reserves, and even bilateral agreements with African neighbors rather than submit to IMF demands. For an institution that prided itself on discipline and compliance, Ghana's rebellion was more than a policy disagreement. It was an open act of defiance. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the picture was even bolder. President Ibrahim Traoré, who had already gained international attention for nationalizing the gold industry and expelling foreign interference, drew a red line. Burkina Faso would not go down the IMF's path at all. In a speech that reverberated across Africa, Traoré declared, "We cannot build our house with the keys of another. Our economy must rise on the foundation of our own people, not on the debt of others." His words carried not just the weight of defiance, but the promise of a new model. Instead of borrowing billions from abroad, Burkina Faso was channeling revenues from gold, cotton, and state-owned enterprises into development projects. The country launched programs for affordable housing, food sovereignty, and industrial self-reliance, all without IMF supervision. The significance of these two stories, one of rejection, one of refusal, cannot be overstated. Ghana represents the breaking away of a longtime IMF partner, signaling that even the success stories have lost faith. Burkina Faso represents the outright rejection of the IMF model altogether, a refusal to even enter the system of dependency. Together, they form the bookends of a rebellion that strikes at the heart of global financial orthodoxy. For ordinary Africans, this is not just about economics, it is about dignity. Every cut to subsidies meant children going hungry, hospitals running out of medicine, and families slipping further into poverty. The IMF's policies were not abstract formulas, but real hardships lived daily. That is why the defiance of Ghana and Burkina Faso has electrified so many. It is a reminder that nations too can say no. And while the boardrooms of Washington still glow late into the night with calculations and forecasts, the streets of Accra and Ouagadougou tell a different story. Here, men and women march with signs that read, "Our future, our choice." Here, the IMF's aura of inevitability begins to shatter, and from here, whispers of a wider African rebellion are beginning to spread. The turning point came when Ghana's defiance was no longer an isolated gesture, but part of a chain reaction shaking the continent. The IMF expected Accra's government to eventually fold under pressure as so many nations had done before. But instead, something extraordinary happened. Burkina Faso's President Ibrahim Traoré stood shoulder to shoulder with Ghana, and together they lit the spark of rebellion. The climax unfolded in two simultaneous theaters. In Accra, lawmakers announced a temporary suspension of negotiations with the IMF. The parliament chamber erupted, half the house applauding, half in shock. Crowds outside the building celebrated as if a colonial chain had just been broken. The chant "Down with IMF" echoed in the streets, carrying a symbolic weight far beyond Ghana's borders. In Ouagadougou, the stage was even more dramatic. President Ibrahim Traoré delivered a nationally televised speech framed against the country's flag and flanked by soldiers. He declared, "We will not enslave our children with debt. We will build our economy with our own hands, and if that means standing alone, so be it." The broadcast spread across Africa like wildfire. Within hours, it was being replayed on local stations in Bamako, Niamey, and Dakar. For many viewers, it was not just a speech, it was a declaration of war against decades of financial servitude. What followed was an outpouring of public emotion. In Mali, youth organizations marched through Bamako holding signs that read, "We are next." In Niger, activists gathered in front of the central bank demanding a similar rejection of IMF dependency. Even in South Africa, students at the University of Cape Town staged a solidarity rally warning their government that Africa will not be sold off in pieces. The rebellion was no longer confined to two capitals. It had become a continental chorus. International reaction was swift and divided. In Washington and Brussels, officials expressed concern over what they described as irresponsible economic experiments. Financial analysts warned of a dangerous precedent that could destabilize investor confidence across Africa. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline that read, "Africa's Rebellion Risks Global Shockwaves." CNN framed the movement as populist grandstanding, while independent outlets like The Intercept praised it as the beginning of IMF's reckoning. Meanwhile, in Latin America and Asia, the story was received very differently. Commentators in Argentina and Brazil recalled their own painful histories with IMF austerity programs, suggesting that Africa's defiance might inspire a second wave of global South solidarity. In Pakistan and Sri Lanka, two nations still under IMF supervision editorials openly asked whether they too should follow Ghana and Burkina Faso's path. Inside Africa, the emotional climax was palpable. For decades, people had whispered about IMF injustice but felt powerless to act. Now, with two nations standing firm, whispers had turned into roars. A Ghanaian farmer interviewed by local radio captured the sentiment best. "For the first time, I feel my sweat is mine. Not for Washington, not for Paris, mine." But perhaps the most striking reaction came from ordinary Americans who stumbled across these events in international coverage. For older viewers, those who remembered the Cold War or the collapse of the Soviet Union, the parallels were chilling. If an institution as entrenched as the IMF could face open revolt, what else in the Western-led order might soon unravel? By now, the climax had crystallized into a broader narrative. This was not only an economic story, but a moral one. The question was no longer whether Ghana or Burkina Faso would survive without the IMF. The question was whether the IMF itself could survive Africa's rebellion. The rebellion against the IMF did not remain confined to speeches and protests. It began to reshape the daily realities of people in both Ghana and Burkina Faso, producing ripple effects across the continent. In Ghana, the suspension of IMF negotiations triggered both relief and anxiety. For ordinary citizens, it meant a chance to breathe. Fuel subsidies that were about to be cut remained in place, saving thousands of families from further hardship. School teachers who had braced for budget cuts were told their salaries would continue without interruption. In marketplaces across Accra, traders celebrated with the phrase, "We are free for now." Yet this freedom came with a price. International credit ratings agencies immediately downgraded Ghana's bonds, making it more expensive to borrow on global markets. Western news outlets predicted economic collapse. But on the ground, Ghanaians felt a new sense of pride. Even if the road ahead was uncertain, at least it was theirs to walk. In Burkina Faso, the political consequences were even more striking. President Ibrahim Traoré's firm rejection of the IMF became a rallying point for national unity. Citizens who once felt disconnected from politics now saw themselves reflected in his bold defiance. Villagers in the Sahel, long accustomed to poverty and neglect, began to speak of a second independence. Across Ouagadougou, murals appeared on walls depicting Traoré breaking chains labeled IMF and debt. To many, it felt like a rebirth of the spirit once embodied by Thomas Sankara. But with this surge of unity came new tensions. Opposition figures accused the governments of gambling with people's livelihoods. In Ghana, critics warned that rejecting IMF oversight could worsen inflation and drive away foreign investment. In Burkina Faso, political opponents claimed that Traoré was using nationalism to consolidate power and silence dissent. Yet these criticisms, while amplified in foreign media, found little traction among ordinary citizens who were tired of decades of promises that never delivered. Regionally, the civil consequences spilled over. Neighboring countries watched closely as citizens began demanding similar actions. In Mali and Niger, crowds pressed their leaders to declare independence from external debt structures. The African Union, caught between pressure from Western partners and the surge of grassroots support for sovereignty, struggled to articulate a unified stance. This division revealed a deeper truth. Africa was no longer willing to speak with one voice dictated by external powers. It was beginning to craft its own fractured but authentic chorus. Politically, the rebellion shifted the balance of alliances. Burkina Faso deepened its ties with Russia and other BRICS nations who offered alternative financial arrangements free from IMF conditions. Ghana explored regional partnerships with the African Development Bank and even discussed gold-backed trade systems with neighbors. This pivot signaled a structural change. The IMF was no longer the only option on the table, and Africa was no longer a passive recipient of policies written abroad. For civil society, the greatest consequence was psychological. For generations, Africans were told that debt and austerity were inevitable, that their nations could not function without the guiding hand of international lenders. Now that myth was breaking. A young Burkinabe student put it simply, "We have lived our entire lives in debt to strangers. Now we want to live for ourselves." In both Ghana and Burkina Faso, the rebellion had become more than an economic dispute. It was a political earthquake shaking the foundations of how citizens saw their governments, how governments saw their sovereignty, and how the world saw Africa. The question was no longer whether the IMF could dictate terms, but whether it could survive a continent reclaiming its dignity. From Washington's perspective, the defiance of Ghana and Burkina Faso was not just an African affair, it was a direct challenge to the global order America had helped to build since World War II. The International Monetary Fund was more than a financial institution. It was one of the cornerstones of U.S. influence, a mechanism through which economic rules were enforced worldwide. When Accra and Ouagadougou pushed back, American policymakers saw more than rebellion. They saw a precedent that could unravel decades of dominance. In Congress, lawmakers voiced unease. Some warned that Africa's rebellion could push the continent deeper into the orbit of China and Russia, weakening U.S. geopolitical leverage. Others dismissed it as political theater, predicting Ghana would eventually come crawling back when markets tightened. Yet, behind closed doors, Treasury Department officials admitted a harsher reality. If more African nations followed suit, the IMF's credibility itself might collapse. The U.S. media reflected this tension. Outlets like the New York Times framed the story as a risky gamble by fragile states, while more conservative voices argued it was evidence of Russian manipulation in Africa. Independent journalists, however, highlighted the human side, families finally escaping austerity, governments daring to imagine alternatives. This divide mirrored America's own internal struggle between defending the status quo and acknowledging its cracks. Europe, too, was rattled. France, once the dominant power in West Africa, watched in alarm as Burkina Faso led the charge against institutions Paris had long supported. European Union officials issued cautious statements about stability and responsible governance, but privately admitted that their influence was waning. In Germany and Italy, where memories of IMF intervention during the Eurozone crisis still lingered, commentators sympathized with Africa's stand warning that the West should not underestimate the movement's moral force. Elsewhere, reactions revealed the global stakes. In Latin America, newspapers in Buenos Aires and São Paulo ran headlines declaring Africa leads where we could not. In Asia, countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka, still under IMF programs, saw growing calls to reassess their own relationships with the fund. Even in the Middle East, editorials noted that Africa's defiance might embolden debt-burdened nations from Jordan to Egypt. But perhaps the most overlooked perspective came from ordinary Americans. For viewers over 60, those who remembered the collapse of the Soviet Union or the Vietnam War, the sight of once subservient nations standing tall carried a haunting familiarity. Just as Americans had once watched empires crumble abroad, they now wondered whether the institutions of their own era, the IMF, the World Bank, even NATO, might face a similar fate. Letters to local papers in small U.S. towns captured this unease. If Ghana can defy Washington, what happens when others do too? Globally, the rebellion also reawakened long-dormant debates about fairness. Was the IMF truly about stability, or was it a tool for enforcing Western dominance? Did austerity save economies, or did it sacrifice people for numbers? These questions, once confined to academic circles, were now shouted in streets from Accra to Caracas. For Africa, the message was clear. The continent was no longer a silent partner in its own exploitation. For the world, the implication was profound. If the IMF could be challenged here, it could be challenged anywhere. And for the United States, the rebellion was more than a foreign policy issue. It was a mirror forcing America to confront the possibility that the system it built was not eternal, but fragile, and perhaps already beginning to fracture. History often turns on moments that seem small at first: one speech, one protest, one act of defiance. But the events in Ghana and Burkina Faso may prove to be far more than passing headlines. They may be remembered as the beginning of the end for one of the most powerful institutions of the modern age, the International Monetary Fund. The warning signs are unmistakable. Once described as the financial doctor of the world, the IMF now finds its prescriptions rejected, its authority challenged, and its credibility fractured. What began as murmurs of dissatisfaction has grown into open defiance, and if more African nations join this rebellion, the fund could face an existential crisis. The collapse of IMF control would not mean an immediate collapse of the global economy, but it would signal the birth of something new, something that terrifies those who benefit from the old order, a multipolar world where Africa speaks with its own voice. Yet there are dangers too. Breaking free from IMF oversight is no guarantee of prosperity. Without careful planning, without transparent leadership, nations may stumble into new forms of dependency with Russia, with China, or even with private financiers waiting in the shadows. The question is not only whether Africa can say no to the IMF, but whether it can truly build systems of sovereignty that protect its people for generations. For the United States and Europe, the warning is equally stark. If institutions like the IMF are to survive, they cannot remain instruments of control. They must change or risk being swept aside by the tide of history. Older Americans watching today might recall the words once spoken about the Soviet Union. It looked permanent until the day it wasn't. The same could one day be said of the IMF. So I leave you with this question. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet, or should Africa look for someone else to carry the torch of financial independence? Please share if you feel that you are one of the first to know about and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because what we are witnessing today is not just about Ghana or Burkina Faso. It is about the rebirth of Africa, the reshaping of the world, and the reminder that no empire, financial or otherwise, lasts forever.